The rumble shook the earth before anyone could see what was coming. In the wide, golden hush of early morning, a splintering crack erupted down the fence line as 47 bulls, broad-shouldered and snorting wild, thundered through the boards onto her land. They moved like a living river, tossing clods of dirt into the air, flattening tender crops and sending chickens squawking for cover. From the road above, neighbors still in their pajamas and boots stood frozen, coffee mugs half raised, jaws dropped in disbelief. Someone murmured, "That's it for her." For a long moment, nobody moved except the bulls, trampling and ripping through fields that had taken seasons of sweat to nurture. The rich neighbor stood back by his polished truck, a half-smile lurking beneath his expensive hat, making no move to help. She appeared at the porch, hands clenched at her sides, silent and still, eyes taking in the ruin and the crowd. Behind the whispers and the gaping stares, a single question took hold. How could anybody come back from this? The answer, unknown to everyone watching, was about to rewrite the town's old story of who wins and who endures. Hers was the last family place left on this stretch of prairie, a patchwork quilt of worn fences, dandelion pastures, and fields sown with both hope and memory. Next door stood the wide expanse of the richest man in the county, his gates always swinging smooth on new oil, his hay bales stacked perfect as piano keys. Folks like to say you could tell who owned what by how green the grass grew between the posts. For years, the line that divided their land had held in more than just cattle. It marked who gave orders at the co-op and who kept quiet at church. Hard times made every season riskier. One unforgiving spring could tip her finances from lean to empty, and most days she counted the cost of every gallon of fuel and sack of feed twice. The bulls hadn't just shredded her beans and snapped her fence, they threatened what little security remained, leaving her season's income and reputation mangled in hoofprints. If she failed now, if word got around that she'd lost control or couldn't recover, she knew it wouldn't be just her pride or profits at stake. It would be her family's place in a community that never forgot what the land could take or who it favored most. She had inherited the farm not by choice, but by circumstance, the sudden loss of her mother, an old will pressed into her hand, and a house that still smelled of wood smoke and lavender. She was barely 20 then, tall and quiet, learning to run a tractor by trial and error, her father's old boots 2 sizes too big. There had been years when frost stole the corn, when the barn caught fire and hope seemed almost lost. Every time she stood in the doorway before dawn, listening for something in the wind that only her family could hear. Neighbors would call her stubborn, but she believed her mother's advice, whispered on the last night. Hold on for one more season, and the land will hold you. To her, the fields held stories from 3 generations, memories of birthdays under the willows, tired hands mending broken tools, laughter over hot suppers when the money was gone. Now faced with ruin brought by another's neglect, she squared her shoulders. Giving in would mean losing not just soil and profit, but every ounce of legacy her family had fought so hard to plant and protect. By noon, the scale of destruction was undeniable. The bulls had trampled the bean field to mud and torn irrigation lines like they were threads. They bashed through wooden gates, toppled troughs, and left deep ruts running straight through her late father's hay meadow. Neighbors watching from the fence line began to trade stories with sharper edges. "Should have fenced better," someone muttered, loud enough to carry. Word trickled to town faster than runoff after a storm, that she'd let things slip, that maybe the land would be better off in steadier hands. At the farm supply store, men clucked their tongues and shrugged. Guess some folks just aren't cut out for it. Her own brother, driving in from the next county, surveyed the mess and said nothing, just stood shaking his head in the yard. The rich neighbor, meanwhile, sent a hired man to collect his bulls, all apologies but no offer to help, and later was seen buying drinks for anyone willing to gossip. The air trembled with speculation, pride mingling with pity. Alone in the barn that night, she felt the weight of it settle on her chest, not just the loss, but the gathering certainty that nobody, not even her kin, believed she could drag this place back to life. Exhausted and aching, she wandered the ruined field at dusk, boots sinking into tracks left by heavier beasts. It was then, kneeling to pull twisted wire from the grass, that her hand brushed an old glass bottle half buried by the back fence. Inside was a folded, yellowing page, a note penned decades earlier by her grandmother in looping script. It was a recipe, not for pie or preserves, but for restoring worn soil after a cattle stampede. Spread manure thick, chop what's left to mulch, seed with fast-growing clover, and finish with a top dressing of hope and patience. Waves of memory crashed over her stories of survival through lean years, tales of making do and never letting the ground lie broken. Just then, a long-time neighbor drove by, paused, and called out, "Hazel always swore clover could bring the dead back to green." From that spark, a plan took root. Maybe the bull's damage meant more than loss. Maybe it was the chance to mend both land and reputation in ways no one expected. With her heart steadier, she set her jaw and began mapping out a different kind of rescue, one built from wisdom left in the shadows and the whisper of possibility carried on the evening breeze. She rose before sunrise, determined, a list of tasks and hope pressed into her palm. First, she walked the fence line, mending splinters with scavenged boards and salvaged wire, her hands learning the rhythm of repair. With every hammered nail, she pictured not just what was lost, but what still might be won. The remaining manure she spread by wheelbarrow, layer by thick, messy layer, turning devastation into slow promise for the battered soil. At the supply store, she bought bags of crimson clover seed with the last of her cash, ignoring sidelong glances and whispered doubts as she loaded the sack onto her pickup. Each afternoon, she scattered seed across the worst-hit fields, her boots marking new beginnings where everyone else saw only ruin. Then she placed a notice on the bulletin board at the co-op, temporary grazing opportunity. By arrangement only. Contact for details. Word spread. Within a week, 2 neighboring farmers called, eager for short-term pasture after their stocks dwindled. A cautious partnership grew, a careful fence share, a handshake agreement, and rules set firm. Tension lingered, but it was laced with the hope that money and trust might return to ground thought lost. Night after night, she watched green blades rise in torn pastures, tension easing with every inch. Risk and reward ran together. If her gamble failed, it would be public. But as the farm healed, hope in the impossible bloomed alongside every leaf. By late summer, the ragged pastures shimmered with swathes of green so thick they hid almost every scar. The crimson clover pulsed like a second skin over torn earth, drawing bees, butterflies, and the admiration of everyone who passed. Her cattle grazed alongside fattened, rented herds, the fields thriving and lush in a season when drought had left others bare. Folks in town began to talk again, but this time there was a different note, wonder and curiosity replacing pity or doubt. Old rivals stopped by the fence, tipping hats and studying the fields with open respect. Even the feed store clerk who'd once rolled his eyes delivered sacks of seed and lingered for advice. The rich neighbor, leaning out of his truck one afternoon, offered compliments that sounded genuine and quietly asked if she'd consider overseeing grazing rotation on his lowest pastures. She didn't gloat, but the smile she shared with her brother at supper was pure relief and hard-won pride. By season's end, the farm was the topic of conversation in 3 counties, not as a cautionary tale, but as proof that resourcefulness and grit could trump brute wealth and bad luck. The once scorned fence line became the starting place for new partnerships, and in the knowing looks of her neighbors, she found something she'd always longed for: the satisfaction of being truly seen, not just endured. Long after the fields had turned gold and the hay was stacked high, quiet moments settled across the farm like dew. Evenings found her on the porch, a mug warming her hands, listening to the easy talk of neighbors she'd once feared might turn away for good. Fences, once patched with desperation, had become lines of connection, her brother stopping by with homemade pie, old rivals sharing tools and laughter as the sun went down. Sometimes she'd show a visiting niece how to spot the first shoots of clover or recite the story of the summer. The bulls came a lesson in how even disaster can lead to growth if you don't let pride or resentment take root. The worries that once kept her up at night softened into gratitude for the quiet and for hands still willing to work the land. For the first time, she truly believed in her own place here, not as a survivor, but as someone who'd left the earth better than she'd found it. In the hush between seasons, her legacy of endurance and hope settled gently into the soil, waiting for the next story to take hold. Some storms come in the form of hoofbeats, but the ones that matter most are the doubts and losses we weather quietly on our own. This story is more than a tale of bulls and busted fences. It's the reminder that every outsider, underdog, or underestimated soul carries a strength that can't always be measured by acres or bank accounts. Sometimes it's the disbelief of others that fuels our best ideas, and sometimes it takes a neighbor's laughter to spark new roots rather than fear. What began as disaster was, in truth, a gift, an invitation to imagine what's possible when you refuse to surrender your place, your story, or your hope. As folks around here say, you can't keep a sprout from breaking through the dirt, no matter how hard you stomp the ground. Have you ever been counted out, only to prove otherwise? Did someone else's doubt become the very thing that grew your biggest victory? Share your story below and tell us where in the world you're watching from. Subscribe to join our growing family of rural storytellers. And remember, sometimes the best harvest comes after the hardest fight.